At 6:47 on a Friday morning, the phone that had stayed silent for 11 days finally rang. It was the same man who, less than 2 weeks earlier, had stood in his own lobby and watched security escort me out like I was a stranger who had wandered into the wrong building. Now his voice was shaking. "Raymond, thank God. We need you here right now. The entire system is down." The company he had spent 30 years building was bleeding out in real time, and the only person left who understood how to stop it was the man they had decided was too old to keep around. Here is the part that still makes me smile, even now. I didn't crash their system. I didn't delete a single file, hide a password, or leave one trap behind. I handed them everything they asked for, shook their hands on my last day, and drove home in my aging sedan. Then I waited for the truth to arrive on its own. It always does. If quiet justice is the kind of story you came here for, take a second to subscribe to Alex's Revenge Justice, where arrogance meets consequences and the people everyone underestimates finally get the last word. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because the call at 6:47 was only the ending. My name is Raymond Cole. I was 52 years old, and for 23 years I served as the systems architect at Quantum Tech Solutions in Austin, Texas. I was never the executive giving speeches or posting inspirational nonsense on social media. I was the man behind the glass wall, the one who made sure that millions of dollars in transactions cleared correctly every single day. In all my years there, the company never once suffered a major system failure on my watch. Then Brooke Vance arrived. She was 28, fresh out of business school, armed with words like disruption, automation, and fresh perspectives. And because she was the founder's only daughter, no one in that building dared tell her that confidence and competence are not the same thing. Quantum Tech was never just a job to me. I joined when it was still operating out of 2 cramped offices with mismatched desks and servers stacked wherever we could find a flat surface. Over 23 years, I helped turn that fragile little setup into the backbone of a $200 million business. I knew every server, every backup route, every hidden dependency buried somewhere nobody else remembered. I knew which machines could take pressure and which ones needed watching during peak hours. That knowledge wasn't in any manual. It came from 1,000 late nights, emergency calls at 2 in the morning, failed upgrades, and problems I solved before anyone else even noticed they existed. Outside work, my life was quieter. I had been divorced for 8 years and lived alone in a modest house just outside the city. My daughter, Hannah, was in her 3rd year at Harvard Medical School. Even with scholarships, her tuition cost me close to $65,000 a year, and I never said one word about it. Helping her become a doctor was the proudest investment of my life. That is why losing my job at 52 was not just humiliating, it was terrifying. Tech companies loved to talk about innovation, but when it came time to hire, plenty of them preferred a 28-year-old willing to work for half my salary. Still, I told myself that 23 years of loyalty had to mean something. Brooke made it very clear that, to her, my experience was not an asset, it was an expiration date. Her arrival changed the air in that building almost overnight. She was Richard Vance's daughter, which meant she walked in with a title most people spent a decade earning. Richard had built Quantum Tech from nothing back in the 1990s. He was sharp, hardworking, and usually fair. But when it came to his daughter, he had one dangerous blind spot. He could not see her limits. Within weeks, Brooke had surrounded herself with younger managers who applauded everything she said. Anyone with gray hair who questioned whether her plans were actually possible was quietly labeled resistant to change. Then, a colleague forwarded me an internal email she had sent to senior leadership. "We need to purge the old mentality. It read and replace outdated thinking with fresh perspectives and real expertise." I was 52. Frank Russo, our senior operations engineer, was 55. Dale Bryant, our lead database administrator, was 48. We were not outdated, we were the people keeping the lights on. But Brooke didn't see 20 years of knowledge and proven results. She saw gray hair, higher salaries, and obstacles standing between her and the image of herself as a visionary. I knew then that someone was going to be sacrificed. I just didn't realize she had already chosen me. The decision came on a Tuesday morning in March. Her assistant called and asked me to come to the corner office. The moment I stepped inside, I knew this was not a routine meeting. Brooke sat behind her father's old desk, in a designer suit, typing on her laptop, as if I were already gone. "Raymond, we're restructuring," she said without looking up. "Your position is being eliminated. The company is moving in a different direction." 23 years reduced to 2 polished sentences. I kept my face still. Who will be taking over systems architecture? That finally made her look at me. A small, satisfied smile crossed her face. "Tyler Marsh, my fiancé. He's an expert in artificial intelligence. He's going to bring this company into the modern era." I had met Tyler once, at a Christmas party. He spent the whole evening talking about neural networks and disruption, but when I asked him one basic question about how he would balance server load, he changed the subject. Afterward, out of habit, I looked into his background. He had worked as a junior developer at a small online store that folded after 16 months. Nothing in his history suggested he was ready to manage systems that moved real money. But Brooke wasn't simply replacing me with someone younger. She was handing the spine of a $200 million company to an unqualified man because she planned to marry him. Then she gave me 3 days to teach him everything. "I'll need all documentation, passwords, backup procedures, and emergency protocols by Friday," she said, already turning back to her screen. "Human Resources has your severance package ready." She expected anger, maybe an argument, maybe even a threat. Instead, I nodded. "Of course, I'll make sure everything is documented properly." What Brooke did not understand is that documentation is only the skeleton of a system. It can show you where the servers sit, which password opens which account, and what steps to follow during an ordinary failure. What it cannot give you is judgment. A manual could not teach Tyler that Server Bank C always ran hot on Friday afternoons when the automated reports began. It could not explain why the backup network sometimes hesitated for 30 seconds under heavy load, or how to tell the difference between a harmless pause and the first heartbeat of a cascading collapse. Those lessons had taken me 23 years to learn. Still, I gave her exactly what she asked for. For 3 days, I worked 14-hour shifts, architecture diagrams, maintenance schedules, troubleshooting guides, dependency maps, security procedures, encrypted password files. I documented all of it, honestly and completely. Not because I wanted Tyler to succeed, because if the system ever failed, no one would be able to stand up and say that Raymond Cole had caused it. They would have to face the only truth that mattered. They had been warned, and they had chosen arrogance anyway. Friday afternoon, Tyler finally arrived for the handover. He walked into the server room in designer jeans and spotless white sneakers, wearing the easy smile of a man who had never once been responsible for something that could cost millions if he got it wrong. I set the thick binder on the table between us. "Everything you need is here. Passwords, diagrams, schedules, backup procedures, emergency protocols, and the system's known behaviors." He flipped through about 5 pages before losing interest. "I've been reading about predictive maintenance," he said. "We can probably automate 90% of what you've been doing by hand." I studied him for a moment. He hadn't asked about the failover design. He hadn't looked at the database recovery process. He hadn't even opened the dependency maps. And yet he already believed he understood the system better than the man who had built it. "This infrastructure moves millions of dollars a day," I said quietly. "A small change in one place can cause consequences far away from the thing you touched." He smiled at me the way you smile at an old teacher who hasn't caught up with the times. "I've worked with far more complex systems than this." His most complex system had been a shopping website that went bankrupt in 16 months. But I didn't correct him. I simply slid the access credentials across the table and asked him to sign the transfer record. As his pen touched the paper, I understood what Brooke had really done. She hadn't hired an expert. She had hired a confident amateur and given him permission to experiment with the heart of the company. My last day came the following Monday. I packed 23 years into 2 cardboard boxes, framed photos, a few technical books, an old company award, and the coffee mug my daughter gave me the day she started medical school. Most of the executives didn't bother to come down and say goodbye. The people who actually kept quantum tech alive did. Janet Holloway, our network administrator, caught me near the elevators. "Raymond, are we really letting this happen?" she whispered. "Tyler asked whether we could shut off the failover network because he thinks it makes the design too complicated." I am not joking. Frank Russo, 55, had already been demoted to make room for Tyler's younger hires. Dale Bryant had just learned his own name was on the restructuring list. "This is going to be a disaster," Frank said as we shook hands. "Maybe," I told him, "but everything is documented. If it falls apart, it won't be because I didn't do my job." And I meant it. I hadn't deleted anything, hidden anything, or left a single landmine in that system. I gave them every tool they asked for. What I could not give them was humility. I drove home angry, frightened, and somehow strangely calm. Brooke believed she had removed an outdated employee. In truth, she had just removed the only person standing between her fiancé and a catastrophe neither of them could even see coming. For about a week, I tried to move forward. I updated my resume, called old colleagues, and scrolled through job listings that all seemed to want a 30-year-old with 10 years of experience for half my old salary. The severance covered 6 months of pay, enough to make my daughter's next tuition payment and keep the mortgage current, not enough to make me feel safe. Then, 11 days after I left, my phone lit up late on a Wednesday evening, Janet's name on the screen. I had just poured a glass of bourbon. "Raymond, something is seriously wrong." There was none of her usual calm. "What happened?" "Tyler changed the thermal management settings. He said yours were too conservative, and that his model could cut energy use by 30%. Now half the servers are running at critical temperatures, and the backup cooling won't engage." My hand tightened around the glass. Thermal management was one of the most delicate parts of the whole system. It depended on the season, the processing load, the airflow, and a dozen hardware quirks Tyler couldn't possibly know. "Revert the changes," I said. "Use the manual override in panel B7. The procedure is in the binder I gave him." A long silence. "He won't allow it. He says restoring your settings would mean admitting his model failed." That was the moment I understood this was no longer a technical problem. It was an ego with administrator access. "Janet," I said, "start writing everything down. Every change he makes, every warning he ignores, every person who tells him to stop." "I already am," she said softly. After she hung up, I sat alone in the dark living room, staring at the bourbon I hadn't touched. The system I built was strong. It could survive hardware failures, traffic spikes, power flickers, ordinary human mistakes. The one thing it could not survive was someone deliberately overriding its protections while refusing to admit he was wrong. For 2 days, I heard nothing. Then came that Friday morning, and the phone rang at 6:47. Richard Vance, the man who had let his daughter erase 23 years of my life, was now begging me to save what she had broken. "How bad?" I asked. "Everything is offline. Customer records, financial data, order processing. 3 of our biggest clients are already threatening to walk. If we can't restore operations before Monday, the company may not survive." I stood at the window and looked out at the quiet street. "I'll need remote access first," I said calmly. "Then I'll decide whether this can even be fixed." "Anything," Richard said. "Name your price." I opened my laptop. What I found was worse than anything I had imagined. Tyler had not only changed the cooling, he had rewritten core monitoring and load distribution code using an untested model he found somewhere online. It was like discovering that a stranger had performed brain surgery after watching a few tutorial videos. The first failure had triggered all the rest. Overheating servers shut themselves down. Their work shifted to the remaining machines, which overloaded within minutes. The backup power began cycling erratically. Database checksums corrupted. Then the security platform read all this chaos as a possible breach and locked down whole sections of the network. Every protection I had ever built was now slamming into another one. My phone began buzzing across the desk. Brooke first. Raymond, I was wrong about Tyler. Please help us. Then Tyler himself. Mr. Cole, I may have made a few errors in judgment. Could you help us understand what happened? Errors in judgment. He had turned a stable network into a smoking ruin, and he still talked like a man describing a minor misunderstanding. By mid-morning, board members and panicked clients were calling me directly. I could see the damage clearly through the laptop. But you cannot rebuild a collapsing system through a screen. I closed the laptop, grabbed my keys, and drove toward the company that had thrown me away. This time, I would walk in on my own terms. The parking lot looked like the scene of a public disaster. News vans by the entrance. Employees pacing with phones pressed to their ears. Near the doors, outside consultants, attorneys, and client representatives stood arguing with security. When a company that handles other people's money fails this badly, the lawyers and auditors arrive almost as fast as the panic. The guards recognized me and waved me straight through. Brooke was waiting by the elevator. Her designer suit was wrinkled, her hair undone, and the armor of confidence she usually wore had simply fallen off. She held out a temporary badge with trembling fingers. Raymond, I'm sorry, she said. I thought I knew what I was doing. I was wrong. Tyler stood behind her, pale and exhausted. I think I underestimated the complexity of the existing infrastructure, he offered carefully. Existing infrastructure. That was how he described 23 years of systems refined through every kind of pressure without ever breaking like this. I ignored both apologies. Where's Richard? In the conference room with the board, reviewing our legal exposure. Then let them review it. I walked past them and went straight to the server room. The temperature inside had climbed past 85 degrees. Alarms screamed from every direction. Half the monitors glowed red. Frank saw me first. Thank God. I sat down at the main terminal. Show me everything he touched. For the next 4 hours, Frank, Janet, Dale, and I traced every failure Tyler had set off. The damage was worse than the remote view had shown. 3 days of customer transactions were corrupted, and anything we couldn't rebuild from outside records might be gone for good. 6 servers had cooked themselves and needed replacing. The security lockdown had triggered compliance violations serious enough to invite federal auditors and heavy fines. But the biggest loss couldn't be fixed with new hardware: trust. By Monday, half of Austin's tech world would know that quantum tech had collapsed because management handed the keys to an executive's unqualified fiancé. For the first time in 11 days, competent people were back in control of that room. If you have ever watched experience quietly clean up a mess that arrogance created, you already know how good that felt. If a story like this is keeping you here, subscribe to Alex's Revenge Justice and stay with me, because what I asked for next is the part most people don't see coming. That answer came around 8 that evening, when Richard walked into the server room. He looked like he had aged 10 years since the morning he let me go. Raymond, I owe you an apology, he said. I let my daughter tear down the foundation you built because I was too proud to admit she wasn't ready. I turned from the terminal. I documented everything. I gave them training, passwords, recovery steps, and clear warnings. They had every chance to protect this company. He lowered his eyes. I know. What will it take to bring you back? I had been preparing that answer since the phone rang at 6:47. This time I would not come back as the invisible man they could discard. I would come back with real authority, or I would walk out and let them face it alone. A 5-year contract as Chief Technology Officer, I said. I report to the board, not to your daughter. Full authority over technical decisions, hiring, security, and infrastructure. Richard nodded before I even finished. Done. 2% equity in the company. His jaw tightened, but only for a second. Agreed. And Tyler is gone tonight. He never touches another quantum tech system. Richard glanced through the glass toward the hallway, where Tyler waited beside Brooke. He's finished. Brooke loses all operational authority, effective immediately, I went on. The board opens a formal review of her hiring choices, her access approvals, and every warning she ignored. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. She'll be off operations tonight. The board can handle the rest. I wasn't done. Frank becomes vice president of infrastructure. Dale takes the database division. Janet becomes director of network operations. The people who warned you and protected this company finally get the titles they earned. Richard bowed his head. You're right, all of it. For 23 years, I had been handed enormous responsibility with almost no authority. Now, the same people who had treated my experience as an obstacle were placing in my hands the power to protect everything I had built. I extended my hand. He shook it. Save the company, Raymond. I'll save what can still be saved, I said, but this never happens again. Minutes later, security revoked Tyler's access and walked him out before the night was over. I worked until 3 that morning. Bringing the system back was like defusing a bomb one wire at a time. Every service had to be isolated, tested, and restored in the right order. One careless command could trigger another cascade and erase whatever data was left. Frank rebuilt the cooling controls. Dale stabilized the broken databases. Janet restored the network routes and stripped out every unauthorized script Tyler had left behind. As I finally left, I saw him in the lobby, a cardboard box in his arms, a guard at his side. His expensive shirt was wrinkled, and all that easy confidence was gone. Mr. Cole, he said quietly, I really thought I understood this. I thought the documentation meant I could handle it. The documentation told you how the system worked, I said. It didn't give you permission to rewrite what you didn't understand. He looked down at the floor. I was wrong. Experience is a hard teacher, I told him, but sometimes it's the only one people respect. The elevator opened behind me. Tyler had walked into quantum tech as the brilliant young expert who was supposed to make me obsolete. He left 11 days later under escort, carrying everything he owned in a single box. I rode the elevator up as the new chief technology officer, and the real rebuilding had only just begun. The next 3 weeks were brutal. Frank, Dale, Janet, and I worked 18-hour days repairing what Tyler had destroyed in 11. We restored databases from 3-day-old backups, replaced 6 burned servers, and worked with clients to reconstruct lost transactions wherever the records allowed. No one complained. We were exhausted, but there was a deep, quiet satisfaction in watching experienced people fix problems that arrogance had created. Every evening, I wrote it all down. Each unauthorized change, each ignored warning, each moment Tyler chose pride over procedure, not for revenge, so that no executive could ever pretend this was an accident. And so it could never happen the same way twice. The final report read like a case study in how good companies destroy themselves. It showed that Brooke had bypassed technical review, hired her fiancé despite his lack of qualifications, and given him unrestricted access to systems that moved millions. It included Janet's notes proving that her own employees had warned Tyler before everything fell apart. By the end of the 3rd week, the core systems were stable again, but the company itself was still bleeding. The financial reckoning came faster than anyone expected. 2 weeks after the collapse, regulators and independent auditors began combing through our security logs, our compliance records, and every change Tyler had made. The review dragged on for nearly a month. The penalties came to $3.1 million. The clients were even less forgiving. By the end of the first month, 5 major accounts had walked. 3 of them were among our 10 largest customers, and together they represented $8.7 million in annual revenue. Some pointed to the lost data. Others simply said they no longer trusted us. Most had seen the auditors walking into our lobby and decided the risk was not worth it. By the time the fines, the recovery costs, the dead hardware, and the lost contracts were all counted, the first-year damage had climbed past $12.7 million. And the money was not even the worst part. Quantum tech became a cautionary tale across the industry. At conferences and quiet dinners, executives started using our name as the example of what happens when leadership trades proven judgment for fashionable promises. Brooke could no longer hide behind the word innovation. The evidence was too clear. She had not nearly bankrupted her father's company because the technology was old. She had nearly bankrupted it because she believed confidence was worth more than competence. and because loyalty to her fiancé had mattered more than her duty to the company. For 2 months, she was required to sit in on technical reviews as a silent observer. She could take notes and ask questions, but she could no longer approve or overrule a single decision. More than that, the board no longer saw her as the future. They saw the woman whose favoritism had nearly destroyed everything. And every time Richard looked at his daughter, the pride he used to show had been replaced by something heavier. Her punishment was never public humiliation. It was losing the trust she had always assumed her last name guaranteed. My new office came with a window, nearly double my old salary, and the 2% equity Richard had promised. But the title mattered less than the authority behind it. For the first time, no one could override a technical decision just because they had read an article or heard a clever phrase at a conference. Every major change now required review by people who actually understood the systems. Brooke was quietly moved to the marketing department. Our paths rarely crossed, and when they did, she could not meet my eyes. The woman who once dismissed me without looking up now seemed unable to look at me at all. 6 months later, I was invited to speak at the Southwest Technology Conference about crisis management and system recovery. I almost said no. Then Janet reminded me that quantum tech was far from the only company confusing novelty with progress. The room was packed with executives, architects, and senior engineers. I talked about how knowledge actually forms inside an organization, why complex systems hide risks no manual can capture, and what really happens when leadership removes experienced people without understanding what they do all day. During the questions, a young developer asked whether good documentation should make any qualified person able to run a system. I thought about Tyler. Documentation can tell you which button to press, I said. Experience tells you when pressing it will burn the whole building down. That recording became one of the most downloaded talks of the conference. Within weeks, companies were reaching out for advice, suddenly worried they were making the same mistake, letting experienced people walk out the door before anyone understood the knowledge leaving with them. Brooke's career kept sliding. She stayed in marketing for 18 months, trying to rebuild her name, but every idea she raised carried the shadow of the collapse. Once, in a client meeting, she suggested using automation to cut costs, and a board member quietly asked whether this was another one of those optimization ideas. No one laughed. She eventually resigned and took a junior role at a small startup, far from the future she had once believed was guaranteed. Tyler's fall was harder still. The tech world is small, and the story traveled fast. Hiring managers asked him about quantum tech in every serious interview, and the disaster followed him everywhere. The man Brooke had once called a visionary could no longer find work running critical systems. The last I heard, he had taken a technical support job at a small company outside Dallas, earning far less than she used to pay him. They had tried to make my experience look obsolete. In the end, that experience rebuilt the company, while their arrogance quietly dismantled both of their careers. I stayed Chief Technology Officer at Quantum Tech for 5 years. In that time, we rebuilt far more than burned servers. We rebuilt the company's reputation from the ground up. Every critical change now required independent review and written approval. We built real training programs so knowledge could be shared without pretending a manual could replace judgment. We adopted new tools where they genuinely helped, but no executive was ever again allowed to gamble with the heart of the company just to look like a visionary. 3 years after the collapse, Richard stepped down as chief executive. The stress had aged him, and I think the betrayal of his own judgment hurt him more than any of the money he lost. 2 years after that, he sold Quantum Tech to a larger firm at a strong price. My 2% stake became a check large enough to pay off my mortgage, secure my retirement, and set up a trust fund for my daughter. On my 57th birthday, I announced that I was stepping away. The man Brooke had dismissed as a relic walked out financially independent, respected across his field, and credited with saving the very company she had nearly destroyed. That was never revenge. It was restoration. They held my retirement dinner at a restaurant downtown. Richard came, Even though he had been retired 2 years, in his speech, he admitted out loud that my experience had saved the company from bankruptcy, and that his greatest failure had been letting ambition and family loyalty silence his better judgment. Progress, he said, isn't about destroying what already works. It's about improving it carefully, with respect for the people who built the foundation. After that, I began consulting for smaller companies, reviewing their systems and warning their leaders when they were about to trade stability for a fashionable promise. I also mentored young developers, the ones smart enough to ask questions before pretending they had every answer. One of them once asked me how you know when you have enough experience to make a big decision. You don't, I said. You just gain enough humility to understand what you might be missing. A year later, I wrote a book called The Experience Dividend. I expected a handful of engineers to read it. Instead, it spread through the industry and ended up assigned in a few business programs. My daughter later told me a doctor at her hospital quoted it while explaining why the senior nurses notice dangers the administrators always miss. That meant more to me than any check or any applause. Brooke had tried to erase my value. In the end, the lesson born from her failure went on to protect people I will never even meet. These days, life is quieter than it was during my years at Quantum Tech. Hannah finished her residency and joined a practice up in Boston. She married a kind man, also a doctor, and last year they gave me a grandson. He is 18 months old now. Every few months I fly east to see him, and watching him laugh in my daughter's arms is worth more than any title or any stock agreement I ever signed. Frank and Dale still meet me for golf when our schedules line up. Janet took a senior position in Seattle, but we stay in touch. All three built strong careers once they finally got the authority and respect their experience had always deserved. Then, 2 years ago, an email appeared in my inbox. It was from Brooke. She wrote that arrogance had blinded her, that she had confused confidence with leadership and underestimated the people who kept her father's company alive. She said losing her position and her reputation had finally taught her humility. At the end, she asked whether I could forgive her. I read it twice. For a moment, I considered replying. Then I deleted it. Forgiveness can bring peace, but it does not require reopening every door. Brooke had made her choices, and living with the cost of them was part of the lesson she had earned. Sometimes, when I'm back in Austin, I drive past the old Quantum Tech building. There's a plaque in the lobby now with my name on it. Raymond Cole, Chief Technology Officer from 2020 to 2025. Builder of foundations, guardian of systems. Someone once sent me a photo of it. I have never gone inside to see it for myself. I don't need to. I know what I built, what I protected, and exactly what it was worth. Looking back, I understand that this story was never really about revenge. I never sabotaged a thing. I completed the handover like a professional and walked out with my integrity intact. Everything that followed came from choices Brooke and Tyler made entirely on their own. They traded competence for confidence, experience for enthusiasm, and judgment for words they barely understood. Then reality came to collect the debt. The best part was never watching Tyler leave with his cardboard box, or seeing Brooke lose the authority her last name had handed her. The best part was the phone ringing at 6:47 that Friday morning, and knowing I had absolutely nothing to feel guilty about. I had warned them. I had documented everything. I had done my job. Time exposed the truth without my ever having to say a single "I told you so." I'm 60 now. The special bottle of bourbon I had been saving for years is finally open, and my grandson is old enough to come running toward me when I arrive in Boston. That matters more than any corner office ever did. People still sometimes introduce me as the man who saved Quantum Tech. I don't think of myself that way. I was simply the man who refused to let betrayal turn him bitter. Brooke and Tyler believed experience was disposable, and confidence could replace knowledge. Their punishment was never something I designed. It was the natural price of every careless choice they made. My reward was different. I watched my daughter become a doctor. I saw the people they dismissed rise into leadership. I retired with security, respect, and the freedom to spend my remaining years with the people I love. That is why the best revenge is rarely destruction. It is rebuilding your life so completely that the people who tried to erase you become nothing more than a lesson you no longer need to revisit. They wanted me gone. Instead, I became the reason the company survived. And when I finally walked away, I took my dignity, my future, and my peace with me. If this story stayed with you, do me a favor and tell me in the comments. Would you have stayed silent, documented everything, and let their arrogance expose itself? Or would you have confronted them the moment you walked out the door? Subscribe to Alex's Revenge Justice for more stories where betrayal meets consequences and quiet patience becomes the loudest kind of justice. I'll see you in the next one.